Okay, I'm back. Am I sounding any better or?
Yeah. Thank God.
Better?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
I can always try ditching the headphones too if that's a problem. So
We had a moment of real panic there, Valerie. I don't know what we could have done without you.
Yeah.
Really quickly, I'm going to share the op-ed that Valerie and Dave wrote for the Houston Chronicle. They go pull it up. It was very well timed, impeccably well timed, I would say. Corresponded with today's event, so I was super excited about that. Give me just 1 second. So you guys, if you have time, you can check that out later. Also, for those members that are in the League of Women Voters of Texas, or the League of Women Voters, I'll be sharing some messaging after the call. So if you can stay on, this event is part of our week-long, I guess, day of action. The day of action is actually supposed to be on tomorrow, which is part of the reason why we pushed this event back to today, because we would like for you guys to be able to digest all of the messaging and understand the issues that are going on at the Capitol, so you are well prepared and you have time to digest that info. But then tomorrow, what we're asking is you take some sort of action, because it's the day of action, right? So we are asking that you either call your elected representative or try to contact one of the members of the House Redistricting Committee and just push or support, I should say, the Redistricting Transparency Act. And then TCRP will also have a call to action that they'll be sharing at the end for prison gerrymandering, so you can also include that as well. So yeah, so hopefully you guys pick up the messaging from today, and then tomorrow is the actual day of action. For those that don't feel comfortable talking to elected officials and staffers and stuff like that, we have simple calls to action, one from the League and one from the Texas Progressive Action Network. And I'll be sharing all of that at the end, so you guys don't miss any of it, no worries. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen since we're starting off at the noon hour right now. Then I'll get my presentation up. Go. How's everyone doing today? Good. There we go. And then if you guys could just help us just remember to keep yourselves on mute throughout the presentation portion. And then at the end, we'll give everyone a chance to join in and ask comments and take yourself off of mute, basically. We've got two parts of the discussion today. The first part is going to be a quick recap of the legislative session, and then we'll be talking about an important bill that we need everyone's help on for getting a committee hearing. And then Miguel with TCRP is going to be taking the second half of the presentation, and TCRP is going to be telling us about prison gerrymandering and the work that they have recently been doing on that. Okay. For the first part of the presentation on the Redistricting Transparency Act, it's going to be me, Stephanie Swanson, I guess, leading the discussion. Hopefully not leading. I think Dave's going to be helping as well. So we'll be sharing it. So Dave Jones from Clean Election Texans is also here. And Valerie Street from the Texas Progressive Action Network is also here. Okay, so let me take this into presentation mode. There we go. Okay. So like I said, I'm Stephanie Swanson with the League of Women Voters of Texas. Thank you guys so much for being here. This event is being put on by the Fair Maps Texas Coalition, and we have lots of wonderful groups in our coalition, Texas Civil Rights Project, Clean Clean Elections Texas, Texans Against Gerrymandering, the ACLU, and many, many others. And this event is also part of the League of Women Voters National Day of Action that I was just talking about at the beginning of the call. And just a quick plug for that. Tomorrow morning, the National League will be having their pep rally. I think it starts at 9 a.m. Central Time. So yeah, you can watch the pep rally on their Facebook page as well as their website. Okay, so it's been a very long legislative session. We apologize. I know that I haven't been doing a good job of getting the Fair Maps Texas newsletter out like I did last session. And one of the reasons for that is because we've had to switch gears many, many times over the course of the legislative session. And so, for example, this event, we actually started planning this, I think 2.5 weeks ago, but then we got word that the House Redistricting Committee was going to be having a committee hearing for redistricting reform legislation, so we had to switch gears. And then to make that worse, on top of that, the bill authors for that legislation asked that we did not find too many people to provide testimony. So it really kind of limited our advocacy, and I was really terribly disappointed with that request from legislators. I didn't know what to do. I was 50-50. I still, wanted to do our best to get the bills voted out of committee. So we trusted what legislators were asking us to do. However, we understand that everyone wants to be a part of the legislative process. If you guys remember last session, we pushed really hard for a committee hearing. I think we sent in 6,000 or 7,000 emails, 1,000 postcards, just simply asking for a committee hearing. So I wanted to apologize because I do kind of feel responsible for not rounding up the troops to support this legislation. Okay, but let me take it back. I'm going to take it back all the way to the beginning of the legislative session and start from the very beginning. So the House and Senate adjourned, and quickly after they did, they moved to adopt their House and Senate rules. And so you always want to pay very close attention to these operating rules, these procedural rules that they put in place, because it is going to dictate how the redistricting process will unfold. So unfortunately, they adopted, both chambers adopted House and Senate rules that were very similar to the rules that were used in 2011 that led to discriminatory maps being put in place. And so the Fair Maps Texas Coalition did send a letter, and we did get some press coverage over it. And all of this information, by the way, is on our advocacy blog, and the link for that is up at the top of this slide. And you can go back through and read all of this in great detail there. But we urge the House and Senate to change these procedural rules, because that is what a federal district court had called for. And we even pulled in some of the old lawyers and attorneys that were around and defended the redistricting litigation in the last decade to try to see if they could convince the House and Senate to do a better job this time around. Unfortunately, some of these exact same rules are in place. I'm not 100% entirely sure if when this special session calls a special session in the fall, if to adopt new House and Senate rules, we'll have to wait and see what that looks like. The one improvement that we did see that I did want to mention quickly was that the Senate did opt to at least show the maps. Like, so if you had an amendment on the floor and the amendment would change a certain district, you were at least now they're obligated to have a map to show you how that change would impact the district. When I heard that, I didn't know that that was a problem in 2011. Apparently they were just listing the precinct numbers that they wanted to swap out for the bill amendment. So people weren't aware of the changes that were being made. That is an improvement, but that is a far cry from what we need to have a fair and open process, right? We need to have more advance notice of when the maps are going to be posted. We need time to review the maps at least 2 weeks after those initial plans are passed. And there are many, many other talking points that we put together to help create that fair and open process. And you can also read those points on our Fair and Open campaign on our website. Okay. So we're kind of stuck with some really bad rules this time. The one good thing I did want to mention, though, was that through our advocacy work, we were able to convince the Senate Redistricting Committee to hold their public input hearings virtually. And that was, at the time, the only committee that was offering hold virtual hearings. So that was great. And now we see that the House Redistricting Committee is opted to do the same. So that was one also good talking point that I wanted to put in. Unfortunately, though, on the Senate side, what we saw was we actually ran into a problem. There was a group in Houston that reached out to us for help, the Houston Department of Transformation. Their group has a lot of Spanish-only speakers, and they requested our help getting an interpreter set up for the committee hearings. House side, that wasn't a problem. For some reason on this side, it was. And so we called up to the committee clerk. We asked for an interpreter, and they said, we don't have an interpreter, but what we do have is a committee member that will be able to provide translation services basically and help at the committee hearing, but they wouldn't guarantee that a committee member would be present. Not only that, but that told us right there that if someone from the Asian American community or any other community that speaks a language besides Spanish were to show up, that person wouldn't be able to participate in the hearing. And so TCRP, the Texas Civil Rights Project, did put together a letter. We sent a stern warning to the state that they could possibly be violating the Voting Rights Act. And then we turned that issue into a language access campaign, and we recruited people to provide in-language testimony at the Senate's hearings. And it went really well. We got some press coverage for it. It went so well, in fact, and I think Joaquin's letter was so strongly worded that it kind of did scare the House committee at least. And so they've actually, in their budget bill, decided to fund an interpreter for the House Redistricting Committees moving forward. So we did actually improve the process just with a strongly worded letter. So I wanted to also say thanks to everyone that worked on that campaign, for all of the communities involved. So then I also wanted to mention that the House is continuing to hold public input hearings. Like I mentioned earlier, these hearings are being held virtually. And there's one that's going to be held this upcoming Saturday, and there's still time for everyone to register for it. The focus of the hearing will be on Central Texas, but if you live in another part of the state, you can still present. The one problem that we're seeing on the House side now is that they're not giving advance notice of these hearings. Only 5 days basically. And then also you have to have a printer at home to be able to participate, because what they're asking you to do is print off a form, sign it and scan it back. And this did prevent already one person from being able to participate. And so we're going to be following up with the House Redistricting Committee on that. Senate Bill 11 was the next big issue that I wanted to talk about. And this is I've highlighted it in red because I think it's the most important thing that's happened this session. Because it really plays into setting the stage for the redistricting cycle in the fall. So with Senate Bill 11, the bill author was the chair of the Redistricting Committee, Senator Joan Huffman. She's also the chair of the Jurisprudence Committee. And so Senator Huffman, along with I guess I can say this, a very right-wing conservative group called Texans for Lawsuit Reform. This bill was actually this lobbying group's idea, and they wanted to drastically redistrict the Court of Appeals district. So currently we have 14 courts of appeals. They wanted to reduce that number to 7. And so the whole process that Senator Huffman used to bring this bill forward was completely flawed. And she used the exact same problems that a federal district court says were deficient in the 2011 round of redistricting and got the state in trouble. And so what she did was, first of all, she sent the bill to jurisprudence instead of redistricting. She did not solicit public input on the bill whatsoever. Our group found out about it because she emailed the current sitting justices just 3 days before the hearing. And one of those justices posted the proposed plan on the intranet. So again, they did not have a map visible to the public. Really, what should have happened is they should have posted that on the Texas Legislature's website and posted notice of that plan. They did not do that. I'm not sure if I mentioned, they did not solicit input from groups protected under the VRA. So everything about the process, as I mentioned, was flawed, and a federal district court had already called the state out on these problems over the past decade. So here we are, we see them repeating the same problems and mistakes that they made in 2011. So a lot of voting rights advocates and attorneys showed up for that hearing and did provide testimony. The proposed plan actually would have violated the Voting Rights Act from what we could tell. And that was just a preliminary analysis, but you had groups like MALDEF with Nina Perales who showed up and provided clear testimony that the proposed plan would violate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. TCRP also showed data that huge restructuring would reduce the ability of communities of color to elect candidates of choice by half. So because of this, the bill author chose to withdraw the legislation, and that was the first time something like that has ever happened. So we were successful at getting that bill retracted, which was great. That was another big win for voting rights advocates and for our group as well. But like I said, this really sets the stage for 2011, and it's very blatantly obvious and painfully obvious that they have not learned from the mistakes that they made in 2011. And this really sets the stage for the fall. We are going to have to work harder now to hold them accountable, to watch redistricting as it unfolds, and to try to push and make the process as transparent as possible. And that kind of sets the stage for the rest of the talk. I did want to mention really quickly before we move on to the rest of the talk, though, that the House Committee, last week they did hold a committee hearing to hear some redistricting reform legislation. However, missing from the list of bills that they reviewed was one of the bills that we're going to be talking about today. It's House Bill 3112, the Redistricting Transparency Act. I'm not sure why they didn't include this bill in the committee hearing. We'll leave it up to you to decide. It could be that they didn't want to promote this bill whatsoever. This bill would just create simple standards for the legislature to follow. They would be in charge of redistricting still, but they would have to follow certain rules to create that fair and open process that the federal district court had asked for. And also really quickly, I did want to mention this past week that the apportionment numbers came out after the 2020 census, and Texas did gain 2 seats. 2 congressional seats. So that was great. That was, I know a lot of people saw that as a good thing. A lot of people here, though, I know helped work on the census and census outreach. And so for those of you that have been following along with this, that have been attending the public input hearings on the House and Senate side, the state demographers both projected that Texas would gain 3 seats. So most likely because of I know the pandemic was a problem, but also the past presidential administrations targeting of the immigrant community here in Texas. I know that also played a really big role in us probably losing a congressional seat as well. Okay, so I did want to say one thing before I kind of turn it over to Dave, and I'll be asking Dave questions, Dave, just to reassure you that I'm not abandoning you. Okay, so there were some of I wanted to list some of the problems, the glaring problems that we saw in 2011, just for those of you who weren't aware, because they were really big. And yeah, it really set the stage for litigation that we saw. It was protracted litigation over the past 10 years. So the court found that Texas's 2011 congressional and state house plans were both motivated by racially discriminatory purpose. And so that's very specific legal jargon, basically saying that the state did intentionally discriminate against voters of color. And so this, what I'm about to read, was pulled out of the bail-in hearing. Bail-in is something that falls under Section 3 of the Voting Rights Act. And it says that a state could be put back under preclearance if they were found to intentionally discriminate against voters of color in the future. And so right now, Texas is not under preclearance. That provision of the Voting Rights Act was gutted in 2013 with the Shelby County versus Holder Supreme Court ruling. So we're entering into this next phase of redistricting without having a federal authority in place to review maps, basically. So we're at a disadvantage. Okay, so a court, though, considered putting the state back under preclearance in 2019 because of all the mistakes that they made in 2011, and this is from that ruling. So it said, with regard to the Texas House Plan, Plan H283, the court found that the overall plan was a product of an intentional vote dilution, again, a very specific legal term, which is basically means that they discriminated against voters of color, and that it was based on invidious discriminatory purpose. The court agrees that the overall configuration of this plan is a product of intentional vote dilution, and the impact of the plan was certainly to reduce minority voting opportunities statewide, resulting in even less proportional representation for minority voters. And so this is the overall plan, the overall State House plan that they're saying was deficient and discriminated against voters of color. But I wanted to list all, they went on, I wanted to list all of the other counties where they found problems of intentional discrimination, because there were a lot. And when I sat and read the ruling for the Balin hearing, I wasn't aware that there were so many findings of intentional discrimination, and I really upset me. So here are all the counties that were impacted: El Paso, Bexar, Nueces, Hidalgo, Harris, Dallas, Tarrant, and Bell. So basically all of our major cities. So this means that we need to be more proactive moving into this next round of redistricting to help protect our communities as much as possible. This means that we're going to need to watch when the new maps are drawn. Also, the court found problems with 2 congressional districts as well, and I've listed those here. And with that, I'm going to let Dave kind of continue on with the story.
Thanks, Stephanie. Appreciate it. I'm sitting here in the middle of a thunderstorm, so if you hear like a thunderclap in the back, it's I guess it's God telling the Texas state legislature that they need to do the right thing. I don't know. Stephanie's mentioned the fair and open campaign that we have, and the fact that that sort of originated from an admonition by Judge Rodriguez in the redistricting litigation in San Antonio back surrounding the 2011-2013 plan, and then the subsequent bail-in hearing that was held where the state was subject to being placed back under pre-clearance because of its conduct in 2011, like she's already described. That didn't happen, even though the court did make all the findings that she described. And that's largely because the United States Supreme Court gave the state of Texas a pass ultimately that the district court in San Antonio was obliged to follow because of the fact that the state had redone their maps in 2013. But the fair and open idea and the admonition from Judge Rodriguez remains, and it motivated our Fair Maps Texas group to begin this fair and open campaign, which I really kind of have these slides out of order, but one of the next slides to come up describes that campaign. And like Stephanie said, it's on our website, but it originated from the admonition by Judge Rodriguez, and it came from that point of view and an attempt by the Fair Maps Texas group to try to do that. If you could go back for a couple of slides to the one with Mark Veazey's testimony, Steph. Thanks. I thought it might be helpful to see sort of why, or at least an example of why the court gave the state of Texas that admonition. This is testimony from he's now Congressman Mark Veazey, but at the time I think he was a Texas senator when he gave this testimony, but he had been in the House previous to that, and when the 2011 redistricting occurred. And the question there is asking him about his district, his own district. And, this is an example of the fact that there was just no disclosure, even to members of the redistricting committee itself. And his testimony was that he found that his district had been changed late at night. And he just happened to open up the Red Apple, which is the computer software program for redistricting, and found my district and been completely changed from what we had all agreed to. And he also mentions Lon Burnham's district, which joined it, which is the Latino Opportunity District, or it was at that time. And his district had been completely changed, and neither one of them had been advised of this. They hadn't seen the maps. They hadn't been told about it. Why don't you go to the next slide, Steph? Thanks. And I mean, this is just more of it. I just think it's worth hearing his actual words. He said, they asked him, was he ready to start on Senate redistricting because he was in the House. And he said, instead of actually having a real debate and a discussion on how the constituents in my district in Southeast Fort Worth, how they were affected, it was pretty much kind of, a good old boy. No, this is our, they passed our plan and we're just going to pass their plan. We're not really going to have a debate over this plan. We just want to just pass their plan. And it's Senator Seliger at the time was just going to pass our plan. That's the House plan. And he goes on to say it says, when you look at the fact that I represent the third largest concentration of African Americans in the entire state, and the fact that they were just going to pass this Senate redistricting bill without any debate about us being moved into a district in the middle of rural Texas, I just thought it was absolutely unfair. And that was just some of the testimony that was heard in the 2011 case. And it's really what gave rise to this admonition that the court has given to the state of Texas that we're trying to adhere to. So let's go on, Steph, so we don't lose too much time here. Steph described earlier the fact that the House at least made an attempt to try to change some of the rules at the beginning of the session to create a more fair and open process. All those proposals in the House were rejected. There was this limited proposal that she mentioned in the Senate for disclosing maps that did get adopted, but it's really pretty limited. And anyway, the response that we had is that folks in our Fair Maps Texas group consulted with Representative Jessica Gonzalez in Oak Cliff here in the Dallas area, and Representative Gonzalez has a personal history of being involved as a voting rights attorney and is very knowledgeable in this area. And working with her office, she created this legislation, which is HB 3112. And you want to go to the next slide, Steph. And she entitled it the Texas Redistricting Transparency Act. And what it does is it really just enacts standards that the legislature has to follow to make sure that there's adequate disclosure during the redistricting process. And this is, like Steph said, with the legislature actually performing it. This is not a commission. This is just under our current procedure. But as we've seen, the legislature, if left to its own devices, doesn't really do such a great job about transparency. So this legislation would compel a number of different things to make the process a lot more transparent. And really, the point of this bill is to just ensure that everybody's voice is heard and everybody has an opportunity to have input into the process. Go ahead, next slide, and I'll describe. This is just the overview. I'll go through it step by step, just quickly. It creates a website. This bill creates a website which can be a focus for all kinds of information relevant to the redistricting process. And there's already some attempt by that that's the Texas Legislative Council does under the current process. But this would supplement it in some really significant ways and require it, which is another thing that does not currently exist, to make sure that all kinds of specific information about the legislative redistricting process is available to the general public. It includes all kinds of information about voting age population, voter registration, election returns. Voter turnout has been an issue in the way maps are drawn in the past, down to the precinct and the census tract level. It's a central place for public notice of all the hearings, and it'll require that maps that are proposed and any final maps showing all those different things are on the website so everybody can see. And it'll have a requirement for a portal for submission of public comments and questions. And then it also requires that a bunch of additional information that's in the bill be posted on the website. Now, there's more detail on that if you want to go to the next slides, Steph. I mean, just a little bit more, first of all, about the public hearings. It requires that there be at least 10 public hearings before the census data are delivered, and then at least 5 public hearings in different congressional districts throughout the state after the census data is delivered. That's real important because in the last round, that didn't really occur. It requires that there be video conferencing options available for public testimony. So it has some real solid provisions on at least a minimum for public hearings.
Can you talk more about the data behind this? Because I think that's another thing that's changed over the past 10 years with Cambridge Analytica, social media platforms, stuff like that. Did you want to talk about the disclosure requirements more?
Yeah, let me go to the next slide. And I first of all, let me give credit on these slides. Gina Foxman with NCJW in Dallas did a great job. She prepared these slides, and Gina and I worked with Representative Gonzalez's office quite a bit on the formulation of this legislation. Sorry, old habit. But one of the other requirements in the bill is some specific things that have to be disclosed, and a lot of it is because of what you just mentioned, Steph. The fact that there's all this additional data, block by block, house by house, that's now available to sort of cut maps in a way that can be advantageous either for reasons that might be racially discriminatory, but also for partisan reasons as well. This bill, just to be clear, does not have a requirement to end partisan gerrymandering. That's something that would require more than this bill can do, but it does hopefully require enough factual information to be disclosed so that people can really clearly see if there is a partisan gerrymandering that's occurring, and any kind of factual information. The bill mandates 8 different types of factual information that pertain to a plan and requires that it be disclosed, and it has to be disclosed in a manner that's, I mean, first of all, published on the website. There's some requirements that if there's any kind of computer level data, that it be available in a format that people who want to analyze these maps can go back and use it to look at the data in a detailed way. People that are expert in doing that can have access to that data too. It's got some specific details about even plans, at least factual information that consulting experts might have developed in the course of helping a legislator or a caucus in the legislature develop their plans.
If someone like Lamar
I'm sorry,
Smith,
I'm just running on.
so if someone like Roger Williams, my congressman, or Lamar Smith, who's no longer a congressperson, back in 2011, they made very specific requests about their districts. Lamar Smith wanted his granddaughter's school to be included in his district so he could easily win his campaign, or it would help him win his campaign. And then Roger Williams wanted his car dealership to be included in his district. So how would this bill prevent that from occurring in the future, those closed door processes by legislators?
Well, it wouldn't bar it, it wouldn't prevent it, but it would mean that if there was specific information that was of a factual nature that was embedded in a plan that legislators have knowledge of, that becomes part of the factual basis for a plan, it's required to be disclosed. And so some of the bad things that have happened in the past aren't absolutely prevented by this. It's just the idea that the sunshine is the best disinfectant, as everybody says, and it's just this way people can be advised about it. And there are provisions also in the bill for disclosure of dissenting views and a report of any dissenters in a committee about a particular map. And a lot of the kind of information like you're talking about, Steph, probably could come out under those in that part of the requirements as well. So it's not going to do away with it. That's something that is not something that could be done by a bill like this, but it would disclose it. Anyway, I think that's pretty much the other thing I wanted to mention about the disclosure is that there is a requirement in the bill that it be disclosed before a vote with sufficient time for people to really evaluate it. And even though our Fair Maps Texas group would like a lot more time in our Fair and Open campaign, I think asked for as much as 2 weeks notice before a map is actually voted on. There's some practicalities in the legislature that we've heard from a lot of people, including Representative Gonzalez's office, that maybe cause difficulty with a long period of as long as 2 weeks. But the bill itself creates a 72-hour period at this point, but there's a committee substitute that Representative Gonzalez would offer as soon as the bill has an opportunity for a hearing that would give as long as 5 days for people to evaluate any final version of a map before it's voted on. Because one of the things that's happened in the past is that committee substitutes will get offered on these map bills because any map that does redistricting it goes through the legislature just like any other bill, and there's a process and the rules in the Texas legislature that allow committee substitutes to sort of be offered under certain circumstances, and this would limit that ability to drop a committee substitute at the last minute right before a vote. And as you saw maybe from Representative Vici's testimony that we had up earlier, that one was dropped in the middle of the night. Changes were made to his district. I see in the chat that somebody's asked for the full list. I can go through the list. We don't have a slide on it, but I don't want to take too much more of our time. We're happy to provide anybody who has a question with some more detailed information. And then I think we've got some links to the bill itself later on in the slides. Go ahead to the next slide. Unless you got a question, Steph?
No, I was just going to say the call to action as well will have that list of what the bill does. And we'll share that at the end of the talk. Okay.
The other significant thing it does is it sort of has the same requirements as far as disclosure once a bill goes to the floor of either house and requires at least 2 public hearings on the final versions that come out of committees before they're actually voted on in the House or Senate, either one. And that, if time permits, and there is a sort of provision in the bill that under certain circumstances, it may not be possible to have hearings in different congressional districts, but if time permits, it requires that those hearings to even be held away from Austin in areas where there's been the biggest change in population. So, but at least there's an opportunity for a couple of public hearings on versions even after they're out of committee and before there's a final vote on the floor, because frequently a lot of things get changed at the very last minute. There's procedures where there's amendments are offered to legislation, and this doesn't really address that, but I think it makes it clear that even this is something that should occur even after amendments are done, and if there are further amendments to a bill once it's on the floor, that they would have to go through the whole process again. And there would have to be additional public hearings where people could see what the impact is of the amendments. So it's really trying to capture all the different rule nuances in the rules that exist in the Texas legislature that work a lot of times to hide stuff. So it has that intent, and I think it accomplishes it in a lot of ways if it could be enacted. Do you want to go to the next slide, Steph? Oh, the other thing that's really great about it is that if it got enacted now, it has an effective date of September 1, which would probably be before any special session where the legislature would consider redistricting in this cycle. You know, the legislative session is pretty long, and we're pretty good getting closer to the end, and we're far into it, but there is still technically time, and that's why we're urging people to contact the legislature and contact members of the committee specifically to see if we can get a hearing and see if there might be some way to get this bill to move forward. But even if it doesn't, we're going to continue to urge it and continue to advocate for greater disclosure. I mean, we all have a right to a transparent process that we can trust. And this is an attempt to try to create that process. So anyway, that's a quick overview, and I'll pass it on, I guess, to Valerie maybe next.
Valerie, do you want to share your screen, or do you want me to just continue on with the slides? Oh wait, you're on mute.
I can go ahead and share my screen. And that way I can just zip through. I don't have a ton of slides left. Here we go. Okay, hold on. Okay, so now we're just going to pick up. Can everybody hear me okay? Just if you can't hear me, just flag me down because I won't be able to see you.
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. So we're just going to recap a little bit and kind of talk about ways that we can take action now. So we've discussed sort of the background of what's been going on in session so far. Dave has given you a little bit of an overview of what HB 3112 does. And so now we're gonna rewind a little bit, and we're gonna just sort of very quickly look at some of the bills that did get a hearing back on April 20th. I feel like that was so long ago now, but this is a great graphic provided by Texans Against Gerrymandering. This is an organization that is also a member of the Fair Maps Texas Coalition, and they kind of laid out for you. And this text might be a little bit small, but we'll try and see if we can get copies of this slides or copies of or a recording of this presentation to you. But anyway, you can kind of see what got laid out back on April 20th. So all of these pieces of legislation are kind of, you can see that most of them have the constitutional amendment, which would establish a redistricting commission. And so as I understand it, the majority of these bills would do Texas legislature, Texas congressional districts. I believe Goodwin's bill also does state board of education districts. Representative Gonzalez's bill, as you can see, just sort of covers U.S. congressional districts only. And these are all excellent bills that would significantly change the way we do redistricting now. But as you can see, their effective date is all, 2023, 2031. We're talking about at that point the next round of redistricting. And so again, to sort of reiterate what Dave just said, one of the really great things about HB 3112 is that it has the capacity to change the process as it is now and help us in this redistricting cycle now. So that's why it's really important, and why we really want to try and see if we can get its day in hearing. So this is another great graphic from Texans Against Gerrymandering, and it just sort of again recaps what's been going on, where we're at so far. So as you can see, they wrote, Texas has been involved in redistricting litigation of some form or another since 1963. Most recently, Judge Rodriguez, that's the federal district judge, said, we've got to do better. We've got to put together a fair and open process. And so Fair Maps Texas introduced our fair and open campaign, where we sort of highlight, I don't know where my mouse is, I'm so used to being able to point, but where we sort of highlight ways in which we can help that redistricting process take shape. So, we've asked for public hearings after census data is released. We're asking for those hearings we're asking for virtual opportunities to testify. We're asking for time to review the maps, time to review any changes to proposed maps. And we want them to show us their work. We want them to be able to provide analysis on how their new maps would impact VRA protected groups. And then right here in this middle square on the second tier, you can kind of see a recap of what happened, what Stephanie talked about with SB 11 and with Senator Huffman, kind of just reiterating that we're in serious trouble, that the lessons of 2011 were not learned. And if we're not vigilant, we could end up right back in similar scenario where we don't want to be. So again, HB 3112 kind of helps the process as it is currently, and improves upon it as it is currently, and kind of puts those good standards in place that we should already have, that are really just sort of the bare minimum of what Texas lawmakers should be doing for Texans and a fair redistricting process. So one of the ways that we can take action and have an impact is to call members of the House Redistricting Committee. And so this graphic here, again, provided by Texans Against Gerrymandering, gives you a quick look at who sits on the committee. So it's got 7 Republican members and 6 Democrat members, and then the chair, who is a Republican, and the vice chair, who is a Democrat. So 15 members total. And all of their contact information is there. We're urging people to just sort of call members of the committee, voice support for HB 3112, ask that this bill be given a hearing, be taken up and considered as soon as possible, because time is of the essence. I'm pretty sure, and we'll make sure before the end of this call, but I'm pretty sure that there were going to be talking points at some point laid out to kind of give people little bit of guidance on what they can say if they're going to be making phone calls.
I have a script that I prepared, and I wanted to give a shout out to Tim Dowling, who helped me this morning put that together. So thanks, Tim. But we have a script if you guys want to make phone calls to elected officials. And if you don't want to make phone calls to elected officials, if you want to copy and paste and send an email, there's that option. The League has a take action form on the Redistricting Commission bills, and the Texas Progressive Action Network has one specifically for HB 3112. All of that will be emailed out to everyone at the end. And I can also, if you want to stay on afterwards, I can go through the Google Doc and we can talk about some of the other stuff in there I've included as well.
Excellent. Yeah. So that's contact information for the committee, and that just sort of gives you a view. Some of you may be very familiar with who the committee members are, but some of you, this might be the first that you're getting to see their faces. This is who they are. The other thing that we have going right now is the letter campaign, and this is what Texas Progressive Action Network has sponsored. So this letter campaign just sort of sends a quick ready to go message to every member of the committee, urging them to give HB 3112 a hearing. And so that's the link right there. I was going to drop the link in the chat as well, but I imagine we'll probably send this out to you after the event today. So unless somebody else wants to drop it in the chat, go for it. And then the last thing is, we're urging you to use your social media platforms. It's such a big way, especially during session, of getting not only lawmakers' attention, but also media and other people who follow all things #TextLeg. So we do have a toolkit here that I can also make sure the link gets sent out to you afterwards, or somebody can drop that in the chat also. But the social media toolkit just gives you some graphics to use, gives you some advocacy points about the bill, gives you some sample posts, and then also just links to a tweet of Fair Maps Texas that you can elevate that kind of has a video talking about the bill, kind of giving some background about the bill. And then I think it also has the calls to action that I've just laid out. So it has links to all of those as well, so that you can go back and revisit those whenever you need to. But yeah, using your social media platforms to amplify this information and to build public awareness about this bill is a really big help in terms of building support in a very short amount of time. You know, we've launched all of this stuff very quickly, and we've had some really great response so far. But if we can kick it up even higher in this last week of April, that would be wonderful. And then the next slide, I think, is just some more links. So that top blue link is the bill text that Dave was talking about. There's also a bill summary by Dave there, links to the committee membership, links to a link to the Fair Maps Texas Fair and Open campaign, and then contact information for Gina and Dave. Gina is also part of the Fair Maps Texas Coalition. And then also, as you can see down at the bottom, there is an announcement for the upcoming hearing happening on May 1st at 10:30. And I think that's it for my stuff. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing so that I can.
You know, let me, I want to, if just to make sure we don't forget it, to add about that May 1st hearing that, I mean, because it's coming right up, there is a requirement that you register 24 hours before. So you've got to get that in just to make sure that you have the right to testify. And I mean, unfortunately, it also has that process that Stephanie was talking about, where you've got to copy and sign a form and so forth, which is really not something that we appreciate, but if you want to testify, you got to do it anyway.
We got a few questions coming up. Rabbi Nancy, hi, how are you doing? Glad you could be here. Nancy Caston from the Dallas.
Glad to be here, thanks.
Do you want to ask a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm actually putting together a sort of Hail Mary for the last 2 weeks of the legislative session, you know, calls to make to influencers on different bills of interest to the faith community, and this is certainly one of them. So I was just wondering, in addition to the Redistricting Committee, if there are any other individual legislators or committees that should be, you know, on the short list for calling.
So I would stick with the committee as kind of like a funnel at this point. You have to target the place where it's being held up. So that's the committee as of right now.
Okay, great.
It's kind of up to the bill author has already requested a hearing be held. So it's mainly, we should probably just be targeting the chair of the committee. That being said, we still want to be polite and we don't want to pester too much Chair Hunter. But, you know, if you do want to send as many emails as you want and calls as well, we just don't want to overload his office too much and get on the bad list, because we still have to work with these folks in the future.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Okay, I know Bill Betson has a question too. Bill, do you want to hop off mute and ask?
Well, obviously, I'm looking for basic information. That's why I was so interested in the 8 information items this bill would require. Is it correct to say that currently the transparency they have, almost none of it is mandated? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Oh my gosh. So in other words, everything they give us is just on their goodwill only.
You know, I don't know. You know, I'm not an expert on the rules of the House of Representatives of the state of Texas, and they're lengthy and they change every session to some extent. I mean, they vote on them every time. And I mean, there may be some rules that would require certain things. And like I said, the Texas Legislative Council, which is a nonpartisan state agency that serves the House and the Senate, does research and so forth. There's a pretty extensive website that they have on the redistricting process. And as things go forward, Maps are posted there. But as far as I know, there's no real requirement for that. I mean, that's something that the Leg Council does, and there's obviously permission that's given by the legislature itself to do that. So, I mean, I'm hesitant to say that there's absolutely nothing. That may be an overstatement, but there's not anywhere near the detail that is necessary to make sure they disclose everything, because the details are important. And I mean, I appreciate your question about the 8 different requirements. It would just take us a while, and we're running out of time. I'm happy to actually the bill summary that I did that was linked earlier is a shorthand way to do that, so you don't have to actually go look at the text. But the bill itself is not that long. The thing about it is that, I mean, it's just trying to capture the tricks basically that are used to hide things. I mean, because there are certain things that they can do to find out not only detailed block by block and house by house information, but also to keep it from being revealed when they change things at the last minute. And there's consulting expert exceptions. There's consulting lawyer exceptions that have been asserted in the past. And this is an attempt to try to get around that. It's not that's if anybody that's familiar with discovery in the civil litigation context would know that a lot of discovery fights in a lawsuit are over what has to be disclosed and what doesn't have to be disclosed. But some of the provisions in this bill are an attempt to try to actually follow the Texas rules of civil procedure, some of the requirements in there about what has to be disclosed. And that's why it even gets into, and the 8 things include factual information that's known to consulting experts and attorneys, because they're under certain circumstances in the rules of civil procedure here in Texas. That kind of information has to be disclosed to the other side in a litigation. Now, the opinions of those experts can be protected, and that would continue to be protected also, but unless it's disclosed some other way. But it's the underlying factual information that's required.
Well, related to that, how can they create a legislative map for the 40 new positions we're going to have in the congressional office now? How could they create a map for that office wherein right now we have about 42% of the Texas that is Anglo non-Hispanic? How can they create those 40 maps so that 60% are Anglo non-Hispanic majority and get away with it?
They didn't to a certain extent, they didn't last session. They got called out by the federal court, right? So in 2011, the maps didn't get pre-clearance from the Justice Department, and also
that's when their percentages were above 65. Didn't they just hone it down to about 60?
So it's a very specific case law that you have to follow. First of all, you have to have enough dense geographic population in order to advocate for that district. And so that goes into the jingles factors. And that's another talk, another talk on its own. Okay. But there's specific requirements that these districts have to follow. And so the congressional plans last time, there were multiple findings of intentional discrimination. I listed a few of those districts. I know there were others that didn't go on to be considered intentionally discriminatory, but they were part of the lawsuit. But it's very complicated to comply with the Voting Rights Act and create those districts that comply with the Voting Rights Act. At this point, though, I want to go on and turn it over to Miguel and the Texas Civil Rights Project so they can give everyone an update on prison gerrymandering, because I know a lot of people are interested in this, and it really does further continue to erode our democracy and our access to equal representation. So Miguel, are you still here?
Yes, thank you. And I know we're running up on the hour, but I won't take too long. And sorry for the awkward background. I have a teenage kitten who's taken over my workspace. So I'll be sharing.
I would like to request that you take your time and do your original spiel, and we can share out the recording, because I'd rather be able to share the info and then folks can go back and watch it later.
That sounds perfect. And I think I naturally speak a bit fast. So if there's any point that needs to be reiterated or passed over again, please feel free to let me know. But I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
I'm going to present. Awesome.
Looks good.
Great. So prison gerrymandering is essentially one of the not so commonly talked about types of gerrymandering. We talk a lot about racial and partisan gerrymandering, but this is another that the Texas legislature has employed in the past. And all indications show that they might employ it again this redistricting cycle. And so I want to talk about a bit about the problem and then contextualize it to the state of Texas, and then talk about some of the legislation currently in this session that would address this problem. And so to give a bird's eye view definition of prison gerrymandering for anyone who's unfamiliar with the term, it's essentially the practice whereby state and local governments count incarcerated individuals as residents of their facilities instead of their last recorded addresses when drawing electoral district lines. And so this, to give kind of like an example of what that would look like, you can take a jurisdiction in the state of Texas that has a total population of 10,000 non-incarcerated individuals, but when the incarcerated population is added, that total is boosted to 15,000. And since Texas felons are ineligible to vote while in prison, this effectively provides the 10,000 non-incarcerated people with a boosted political power and representation, while at the same time costing the communities where incarcerated individuals are from the representation and the resources for their own communities. And so to put that in the context of the state of Texas, as of February of this year, there were 112,000 people incarcerated in state prisons, and almost a quarter of them came from the two largest counties in the state, so Harris County and Dallas County. And we also know that Texas incarcerates Black and Latinx people at higher rates than the rest of the population, and that the census tends to undercount these same communities, the Black and Latinx communities, particularly from urban areas, while simultaneously overcounting white suburban areas. And so these discrepancies within the census, compounded with prison gerrymandering, lead to predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods and communities in the state losing out on not just resources that come with the census, but also on representation that's going to affect them and follow them for the next 10 years, while predominantly white and rural communities get a boost in both. And so as during the last redistricting cycle, a lot of estimates point that because of prison gerrymandering, Harris County lost out on one additional seat in the Texas House of Representatives that would have otherwise gone to the Black and Latinx communities of Harris County. And recently, Texas Civil Rights Project released a report with some data to further highlight not just the racial and economic disparities that prison gerrymandering causes, but also just some of the logistics or the lack of logic behind the practice. And so on the left-hand side, I have, again, the number of incarcerated people in their home counties, and then right under that, a visualization of where the largest incarcerated populations are. And so we can see that a lot of, basically our top 5 largest counties are also where a lot of incarcerated individuals come from. But then in that map, we see that a lot of the prisons in the state of Texas are located in rural areas and predominantly in rural East Texas. Some of the findings that our report presented were that out of these currently incarcerated people by the state of Texas, 30% of them would be released by the time the legislature begins to draw maps later this fall. And 70% of the currently incarcerated individuals would be released by the time the next census is conducted. And so the data that's used to draw our electoral maps is based off of data from April 1st, 2020. But we're seeing here that a sizable amount of incarcerated individuals will already be released and more than likely return to their home communities before these maps that are going to take place for the next 10 years are even drawn. And throughout this decade, a majority of incarcerated individuals will be released and more than likely, again, return to their home communities. And so the maps that will be drawn now won't accurately reflect the true population within a lot of these rural counties. I think it's also really important to note that a sizable portion of incarcerated people are also pretrial. So that means that they haven't had essentially a verdict on, they're still waiting their court case, and they're only incarcerated because they couldn't afford to post bail and be in their home community while they await their court date. And then in another sort of wacky, like illogical part of prison gerrymandering, in almost every other legal context, the state of Texas does not recognize incarcerated individuals as residents of their facilities. And one example is from a court case a while back between Geo Group and the state comptroller for public accounts. And basically in this court case, Geo Group, the private prison company, was asking for tax credits by saying that their facilities were residential because incarcerated people slept and ate and lived most of their lives within those facilities. The state of Texas said that because an incarcerated person doesn't have the same rights that a person would in their home normally, they do not count as residents of their facilities. And I think one of the lines from the case was that a home is a castle, a prison is a cage. And so in this way, the state of Texas very publicly said that incarcerated people are not residents of their facilities. And to add that, if there were any incarcerated people in the state of Texas who were eligible to vote, they would be registered within their last recorded address or their home community. So even in the voting process, they're not counted as residents of their facilities. So essentially only in the redistricting process are they currently counted as residents of their prisons. And so I want to talk about some legislation that would essentially make sure that incarcerated people are not counted or instead allocated to their home communities. And that's House Bill 3463, filed by Representative Jasmine Crockett, a freshman Democrat from the 100th District, right on the south side of Dallas. That bill has been referred to the House Corrections Committee, and I left a link on these slides to read the full bill. It's about 8 pages long, and I will share these slides for the information. And to give a bit of a background on the bill, Representative Crockett and the committee that it's in, Representative Crockett, like I said, is a freshman member from Dallas. Her career spans being a public defender, a county party chair, a civil rights and criminal defense attorney, and she is licensed to practice in Texas, Arkansas, and in federal courts. And she filed this bill that not only addressed the issue of prison gerrymandering, but how prisons essentially keep data on incarcerated people and how that data is used by the state of Texas. And so because of that, it was referred to the House Corrections Committee, which I've listed all of the members right there on the right-hand side, which very similarly to the Redistricting Committee has a Republican majority on the committee. And currently, this bill has not been heard in any sort of committee hearing. But to highlight, this bill isn't the first bill in Texas legislative history to be filed addressing this issue. You can see that there have been several bills filed on prison gerrymandering, particularly right before and right after redistricting begins. And just this legislative session, there are 2 other bills filed alongside House Bill 3463 that would address this issue, filed by Representative Dutton and Representative Mesa. And I believe they're 2 duplicates of each other that were filed in the past. House Bill 3463 would essentially take place if voted on by 2/3 of the House in time for redistricting this cycle. If not, it would, but still passed. If it weren't voted on by 2/3 of the House, it would still take effect by January 2022. So it wouldn't take place on time for redistricting this year, but would still be in effect for future redistricting in the state of Texas. And given the increasing rate of incarceration in the state of Texas, this would be a very powerful safeguard from further prison gerrymandering in the future. And now, I mentioned that the bill hadn't gotten a lot of action within its committee. And so Oh, well, before I get into that, I do want to highlight why this bill is really important within this legislative cycle. And that's because the United States Census Bureau is releasing for the first time tools that would essentially facilitate the process of allocating incarcerated individuals back to their home communities alongside the full redistricting data set. And this is really important because typically the Census Bureau would release the full redistricting data set to the states, and then afterwards release the group quarters data after the states had essentially already started drawing maps. And so for the first time, the state of Texas is essentially in a timely position to use the tools provided by the census to then go and reallocate incarcerated individuals to their home communities. And this bill would essentially ensure that the Redistricting Committee does that come redistricting this fall. Now, to help get this bill moving through the legislative cycle, a few weeks ago, the Texas Civil Rights Project did launch a petition specifically on House Bill 3463, and it does send to all of the members on the House Corrections Committee, basically asking that they hold a hearing on the bill and begin the bill's life throughout the legislative cycle. And so I've left the bit.ly link to that petition right there, and have also left the information for the committee to try to push for this bill to get a hearing immediately as we kind of close out the legislative cycle. I think it's also really important to note that even if this bill does not get a hearing this legislative session, a lot of the advocacy around this bill is really important because technically the legislature doesn't need legislation to end this practice. All they really need is the motivation and the ability to do so. And so the tools provided by the census will give them the ability to end this practice, and our own advocacy and push on ending this practice would then hopefully provide the motivation to end prison gerrymandering within this state. And so I highly encourage taking action on this bill, and if not, just further emphasizing to our state leaders that this practice should just end within the state of Texas. I know that I did kind of still zoom through a little bit of that presentation, but I am still more than happy to take any questions. And I can also share the link to the report that has a lot of the sources from where we got a lot of our information to bolster a lot of these claims, like the numbers that I showed on how many incarcerated individuals are in the state of Texas, as well as the numbers to show where in Texas they're being incarcerated. And then some of the other facts that were included in this presentation are also very well sourced in our prison gerrymandering report.
I see one question from the chat box. Folks want to know what the difference is between this legislation and the legislation that was filed in the Redistricting Committee that's similar.
Yeah, so alongside different timelines for when these bills would take place, this bill is a bit more encompassing than just prison gerrymandering. It also includes places like psychiatric wards and different facilities, and making sure that those places also don't count their people as residents of their facilities, and instead allocate them to their last recorded address. And so includes a little bit more outside of the general prison scope, as well as basically putting into law different mechanisms that Texas state prisons need to follow when counting the people within their own facilities. So making sure that the rules are a bit more strict on how well they keep track of that data.
Wendy has asked if you guys think that, what you think the chances are of this bill getting a committee hearing.
Yeah, so the legislative session is essentially wrapping up within the next month. And so getting any sort of legislation through at this point in time isn't impossible, but it is difficult. And so that's why that last point that I mentioned about advocacy still being really important, and that this legislation, if passed, would create a very powerful protection, but it isn't the only thing necessary to end the practice within the state. And so if we can get a hearing on the bill and move it through the legislative cycle, that is of course the best case scenario, but it is not our only hope. And so we can still hold on to a little bit of, or at least I think I'm an optimist, so we can still hold on to a little bit of hope that our advocacy efforts over the summer could influence the redistricting committee to take a second look at this practice and hopefully end it, knowing that they have all the tools necessary to do that.
The League will also be sharing some calls to action regarding prison gerrymandering over the summer. One of the groups that we often partner with, the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, is working with the Prison Policy Initiative, and they have put together a really great letter campaign for folks to send to local jurisdictions to encourage them to either continue excluding the prison population if they did so in 2011, or to consider doing that in the future. So after the legislative session is over, we'll be sure to share that in the League's newsletter, and I'm sure we'll also be sharing that in the Fair Maps Texas calls to action, along with TCRP's work directing those calls to action to the legislator. So yeah.
You know, I noticed a question in the chat also about the HB 3112, whether it could be revived in a special session. I think it's possible that it could be. I mean, it depends on the call that the governor gives for a special session. I think there can be some restrictions on that, but I think that we certainly want to continue to advocate for it and put the pressure on them to pass this legislation at some point. And it could be included in a call on redistricting generally.
And with that, does anyone else have any questions? You can please just unmute yourself. No. Okay, so what we're going to do after this is we're going to, in an hour, give me a time to get everything together. We're going to email out the slides to everyone so you have access to that. All of the slides will have functioning links to all of the resources that we've linked to there. We'll share the calls to action for all of this legislation. I also have a script and messaging if you want to meet with legislators or call legislators tomorrow. If you are a League member, if you could stay on for just 2 more minutes after the call, I just want to say hi and to go over some of the scripts and messaging for tomorrow if you're interested, and to just say hi. So yeah. All right, well, thank you guys so much for staying on. We appreciate it. And we hope you guys take action on the Redistricting Transparency Act and prison gerrymandering. So yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you all. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.